Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and generally when I'm shooting action sports, my goal and my focus is to make sure that I freeze that action. But what happens when you want to get a little more creative and do something different and get creative motion blur? How do you get those settings right for your camera and the situation that you're in? So in just a minute, I'm going to show you exactly how I went from an image where I froze the action to figuring out how I got the right settings to get that creative motion blur. But before I get into that, if you haven't signed up for the FroKnows Photo email list, just look for this orange box over on the website, put your name, email address in it, hit send it, and I will send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations. So let's start off with this image right here. As you can see, I'm shooting a basketball game, well, basketball practice. I was at Kentucky. This is Buzz. He's the coach of Virginia Tech, Coach Buzz. 1/2500th of a second, f3.2, ISO 4000. And yes, I understand that's too high in most situations. You don't need to be at 4000, especially when I've got 1/2500th of a second. That's overkill. I could bring that down. But how do you go from an image like this to, say, an image like this, not saying that this is good, but just playing around to get this exposure to show that there's some action moving? Because this is cool, you know, you captured the players doing what they're doing, but this is cooler because Buzz is right there in the middle and you can see that the players are running through the drills. So let me go to this image to show you where it ends up going. This is at 1/13th of a second at 1/13th of a second, f14, ISO 800. How did I end up going from 1/2500th of a second in the 4000 ISO at f3.2 to this image that, in my opinion, ends up working and being more creative because it has that motion blur? Yeah, let me show you. I'm going to hit this button. You see this right here? It says shutter priority. Now, some of you out there might be saying, well, Jared, you always talk about shooting in manual. Well, that's mostly correct. I will shoot in manual 100% of the time, except for when I go into shutter priority. But let me explain why I ended up in shutter priority. My brain was not computing what I needed to do, so I needed the camera's help to get a starting point. Now, when I'm teaching people how to get out of auto, I let them know that it's real simple. Utilize those auto settings to get a basic starting point that you can then tweak from there. So let the camera help you in certain situations and then figure out your settings. So once I get those settings right with the shutter priority, I can then switch into manual and then I'm good to go with everything else. So that's why I went into shutter priority, because it helped me get a starting point. And now I want to show you how I built the exposure to figure this out while utilizing the help of the camera. So we've got this image. This is where it started with shutter priority. Now let me go back and see all my settings. 1/15th of a second at f22, ISO 4000. Let's draw this out on the iPad. So we have 1/15th of a second at f22, 4000 ISO. Now in this case, because I'm in shutter priority, I went ahead and set it to 1/15th of a second because I know the slower the shutter speed, the more chance you're going to get blurry people going, you know, it's a slower shutter speed, so you're not going to capture motion. f22 was set by the camera because it's setting the aperture, and I, unfortunately, have the 4000 ISO set, which is why this image is overexposed and too bright, because it shouldn't have been that bright. Now let's look at the keeper image settings. We've got 1/13th of a second at f14, ISO 800. And as you can tell from the image, it's a heck of a lot better. Even when you look over to the exposure on the right, it looks like it's right on because I didn't need to move that at all. But let's break this down independently, each setting, to figure out why the camera did what it did and help you understand the exposure triangle some more. So 4000 ISO, one stop is 2000 ISO, two stops, 1000 ISO, and then 800 is more like a quarter stop between 1000 and 800. So we just took 2 1/4 stops of light to get to 800, which is basically cutting down on how sensitive to light your image sensor is. Now, being that we took 2 1/4 stops there, let's look at what we're doing with our aperture. Because we took stops of light away, 2.25, we know that we need to get brighter to compensate for that. So f22 certainly isn't going to work. So the camera knows that. It goes to f16, then after that's f11, but falling in between is f14. So you've got one stop, and two stops would be to f11. So this is more like, we'll call it 1.5 stops just for fun. So you got 2.25, you got 1.5, and then over here, you basically got like a half a stop going from 1/15 to 1/13. That is not a full stop at all. So you can see what the camera did here to get its exposure proper. Now let's look closely at this again. You've got 2.25 stops. If nothing else changed at all, and we took 2 stops and a quarter away from the aperture, we would be close to f10, right? But being within a half a stop isn't bad at all because we gain this half a stop right here. So now that's 2 stops, and you're off by not very far. You're off by like a quarter of a stop between the two images, and that's really it. So once you have these settings right, you can then switch the camera back into manual, set this the way that you want it, and tweak from there to help you get the shots you want because you've already done the work of getting the exposure right. I have no problem using the auto mode like shutter priority in this situation where my brain wasn't clicking to help me get the exposure and then lock in my manual exposure. So let's go through 2 other images. So here you can see it right here. We've got 1/6 of a second. I went even further at f11 at ISO 100. So I played around and tweaked my settings even more because I just wanted to see what would happen. I've got Buzz right here. He's not really moving. He's not as sharp as I would like him to be, but again, I'm at 1/6 of a second with the 14mm. It's probably motion blur on my part because that lens doesn't have IS or VR, but you can handhold wider lenses much easier. But you can see that the pass went from this guy on the right to this guy on the left who's throwing it up to this guy right here. And just the image just looks better because there's some motion going on, but we've got the subject frozen right here in the way of Buzz. Now, that's basically how this was all built. I got tired of shooting the same capturing frozen images. And every once in a while, you need to think outside of the basic box of freezing, freezing, freezing. I'm going to freeze the action. 2, why don't I get creative with my exposure and I have an understanding of what I need to do and then I figure out how I can get there. And I just got some images that are now more creative than just freezing the motion because anybody can freeze the motion by putting up your shutter speed high and freezing it. But when you can help tell a story and convey the movement while freezing one of the subjects, it kind of works. Because what's the point of just freezing everybody doing the drills when you could show somebody doing the drills? Here's an example on the screen right now of another image that I did recently where the character, the cartoonist, the illustrator, is moving his pencil back and forth or his pen back and forth. I wanted to show that, so I went to a super slow shutter speed and got it because I wanted to convey the motion, and I had VR on in my lens, which helped keep the image nice and still. The lines that are already drawn, it helped keep those still because now the VR is kicking in. So I hope you enjoy this video. If you missed the first one that I did where I helped show you how to build the exposure from a really bad basketball photo, that's funny, another basketball photo, go ahead and click on the screen right here. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. And if you haven't hit that notification bell, hit that notification bell so you can be notified when new videos go live. Leave some comments. Let me know what you think. Jared, PolinPhoto's Photo.com. See ya.